everyone, how's it going? Azren, the language nerd here. Hope you're doing very, very well. I want to talk about the following question today, which is there such a thing as a hard language versus an easy language? And ultimately, when you look at this question, I think there's like two different answers. On one hand, I think one could argue that no language is really inherently harder or inherently easier than another. But honestly, on the other hand, a lot of people could say like, well, hang on a second, Azren, when I tried to learn Mandarin, when I tried to learn Russian, when I tried to learn this language, it was way harder than when I tried to learn like Spanish or when I tried to learn XYZ language. And so what the heck is going on here? Well, long story short, it's actually pretty simple. Overall, when you look at languages, there's not necessarily different languages that are inherently harder or inherently easier than another. Like if I was born in China and I grew up around Mandarin speakers, I would find that language probably relatively the same difficulty to acquire as if I was born in Mexico and I was around Spanish. Like, they're going to be, relatively speaking, growing up as a baby, they're probably going to be, relatively speaking, the same or very, very, very similar difficulty levels. Obviously, each language will have specific challenges that people are going to face. Like, for example, in English, I know that a lot of people growing up when they're children might struggle with like the S sound, like a S, like that's kind of difficult for them to do. But that's a completely different topic. It has nothing to do with the overall difficulty or easiness of a language per se. However, I will say this, when we go to learn a language as an adult, we're treading into some different kind of territory, right? Because whatever your specific first language, whatever your mother tongue, or rather, I should be more specific, whatever languages you currently speak is going to have a pretty big impact on what languages you find easy versus hard. For example, right, like if we look at something like English, let's say you're a native English speaker. For you to go learn French, it's probably, likely, going to be easier for you to go pick up French than it would something like Mandarin. And the reason for that is that, first of all, French and English have a lot of words that are actually relatively speaking in common, or that look similar, or that share a similar root. And often when you look at a French word compared to English word, it's just a matter of like slight spelling or slight pronunciation. It's not completely foreign. But when we look at something like Mandarin, it's a completely different story. Mandarin's got these unfamiliar characters that look so foreign to someone who speaks English. Mandarin doesn't exactly have like an alphabet system per se where you put letters together to create words. Not at all. You have to memorize specific characters. Not to mention, Mandarin's got a bunch of like phonetic differences too. It's a tonal language, the sounds are completely different than English. And so overall, if you're coming from like an English brain trying to learn Mandarin, for you, yeah, it might be more difficult, or rather, more specifically, it might take you a longer period of time to go and learn Mandarin to an extremely fluent level than it would, for example, French. And so overall, if we're wrapping this whole thing up, I think there isn't necessarily an inherent like difficulty level per language, and that's really important to actually understand. I think the real scenario, the bigger question, the bigger conversation to have is more around, okay, what languages do you currently speak? What's your mother tongue? What have you learned as a second or third or fourth language or whatever? What did you grow up with? What have you been surrounded with? What sounds are you used to hearing? What sounds are you used to producing, etc.? Looking at a lot of elements like that, and I think those are going to be a much bigger indication as to what specific languages are going to be easier for you and what specific languages are maybe going to be a little bit harder for you. I think that's a more healthy conversation to have. So overall, no, there's no such thing as a easier language or a harder language. It has more to do on an individual, more of an individual kind of basis, or more as like a, I guess you could say, more of a linguistical, or a linguistic, not linguistical. It's more of a it's more linguistic factors that we have to look at that are going to determine what is easier / harder for someone to actually acquire. Well guys, thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate your attention, and we'll talk next time. Bye for now.